History, a paramount priority for progress of a people, arguably the most important cultural property. It is the great unifier of a people. It is the shining beacon that restores vision to the blind. It is imperative that we learn from it, that we may emulate its successes and create a unified effort to prevent repeating its mistakes. For without history, we are without purpose. We are without identity. Welcome to the gray area, where we examine history in hindsight. January 3rd, 1521, Martin Luther is excommunicated by Pope Leo X from the Roman Catholic Church. This started what you now know as the Protestant Reformation. 1777, General George Washington's Revolutionary Army defeats British forces at the Battle of Princeton, New Jersey. 1815, the secret treaty, Austria, Britain, and France formed a defensive alliance against Prusso-Russian plans to solve the Saxon and Polish problem. That was the Prussian Empire. 1833, Britain seized control of the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. It's about 150 years later, Argentina seized the islands from the British and remarkably was able to hold off the British invasion force for 74 entire days before they were eventually overran and subdued by British forces. 1925, Benito Mussolini dissolves the Italian parliament and proclaims himself Supreme Commander, taking the title El Duce, after which El Duce appeals to the League of Nations to ask it for help in the invasion of Ethiopia, the longest standing monarchy in Africa, until its invasion in 1935. 1947, U.S. congressional proceedings were televised for the first time. Viewers in Washington, Philadelphia, and New York saw the opening ceremonies of the 80th Congress. 1959, Alaska is the 49th state. 1961, the U.S. severed diplomatic relations with Cuba. This was in response to Fidel Castro striking up what is now known as the Cuban Revolution, in which he deposes General Fulgencio Bautista, America's proxy sock puppet. Bautista, in service to America, sold Cuba out completely. American companies own nearly 80% of all agriculture, manufacturing, and exports. Bautista had sank the once top-producing Cuban domestic economy to depose the sitting president Carlos Prio. Carlos Prios had a reputation of El Presidente Cordial, the cordial president. It was said of him that he was committed to a rule marked by civility, primarily in its respect for freedom of expression, several public works projects, and the establishment of a national bank and tribunal accounts, of which both financial institutions were state-owned, with the government of Cuba being the sole issuer of Cuban currency. The same move that would later be made by Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Bautista destroyed, economically, the Free Democratic Republic of Cuba and turned it into a banana republic. When he was deposed by Castro in 1961 during the Cuban Revolution, Castro seized all of Cuba's lands held by foreigners and returned it to the people, and then he nationalized it. And in response to this action, America would retaliate with a failed invasion attempt called the Bay of Pigs invasion, or the Bay of Pigs conflict. The following year, on the exact date of Cuba-U.S. conflicts in 1962, Pope John XXIII excommunicates Fidel Castro. 1967, Sammy Young Jr., 21, was shot to death by a 67-year-old white service station attendant. A Tuskegee Institute student and civil rights activist, Young was shot after using the whites-only restroom at the service station where the white attendant was working. January 3rd, 1969, Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is seated by Congress. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was an American politician who represented the Harlem neighborhood of New York City in the United States House of Representatives from 1945 until 1971. He was the first African American from the state of New York to be elected to Congress. 1971, Mark Vesey was born. In 2004, Mark Vesey challenged incumbent State Representative Glenn Lewis at the 95th Legislative District in the Democratic Party primary and won. In the general election, Vesey had no Republican challenger and ran unopposed. He was consecutively re-elected 3 times. During his time in the State House, his most notable achievement was the authoring of HB 62, sponsored by Raphael Anchina, also known as Texas House Bill 1736, or the Tim Cole Act, that honored Tim Cole, an African-American student who had been wrongfully convicted of rape in 1985. As a congressman, Vesey sits on the House Armed Services Committee and House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. Vesey is also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Mark Vesey now resides in his hometown of Fort Worth, Texas. He is married to Tanya Jackson, who was an aide in the Texas Senate. The couple has 1 child, a son who's named Adam Clayton, named in honor of Adam Clayton Powell, who was seated by the Congress 2 years from the date that he was born. 1988, Margaret Thatcher became the longest serving British Prime Minister in the 20th century. Furthermore, she is the only woman to have served in the British Parliament at that time. 1989, the Arsenio Hall show premiered. It is the first time an African American was able to host a nightly talk show starring only himself. In 1990, Panama's leader Manuel Noriega surrenders to U.S. Armed Forces 10 days after taking refuge in the Vatican's diplomatic mission, the same Vatican that just 28 years before excommunicated one of his contemporaries, i.e. Fidel Castro. 1983, U.S. President George H.W. Bush and Russian President Boris Yeltsin signed the Second Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty in Moscow. Arms control negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union aimed at reducing the 2 countries' nuclear arsenals. And it was these same strategic arms reduction treaties that brought about the end of the Cold War with Russia. But rewind back to 1867, Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens and Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner led the campaign for full voting rights for African Americans across the nation. In the speech which Stevens gave in the U.S. House of Representatives January 3rd, 1867, supporting the Reconstruction Bill then being debated, he issued a response to those who said his call was radical and incendiary with the now famous quote, "I am for Negro suffrage in every rebel state. If it be just, it should not be denied. If it be necessary, it should be adopted. If it be punishment to traitors, they deserve it." End quote. Stevens despised the rebel states to such extent that in his famous speech on Reconstruction, he also said this: "They ought never to be recognized as capable of acting in the Union or of being counted as valid states." End quote. He then goes on to say, "We have turned or are about to turn loose 4 million slaves without a hut to shelter them or a cent in their pockets. The infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or of managing the ordinary business of life. This Congress is bound to provide for them until they can take care of themselves. If we do not furnish them with homesteads and hedge them around with protective laws, if we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, it'd be no better than if we left them in bondage. And if we fail at this great duty now, when we have the power, we shall deserve and receive the execration of history and of all future ages. You see, history, much like time, waits for no man. It is up to us to decide whether we choose to make it or be the reason we repeat it. However, we can only learn from it by looking at history in hindsight."